He's Howard Ibach, a former copywriter and creative director, and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 28 years of experience. Together, Henry and I are the Brief Brothers. We love talking about advertising, creative briefs, and briefing. Today, Henry, we have someone who is different. He is a journalist. His name is Tim Nudd. He is the creativity editor for AdAge. It's going to be a great conversation. Let's take a listen. Henry, we're back with another episode of the Brief Brothers, and we are joined today by the one and only Tim Nudd. His beat is creativity for AdAge magazine, and I subscribe. And it's nice to have someone who is connected to our industry, but not actually part of it. So as a journalist, that makes Tim unique, and it should be a fun conversation. So Tim, on behalf of Henry Gomez and myself, welcome to the Brief Brothers.
Yeah, thank you so much. Big fan, and it's great to be here.
Well, we appreciate that. So others out in the ad land probably know you as the editor and the narrator for Tagline podcast, which was part of Clio, Muse by Clio, and you did
Correct.
I get some things right occasionally. A deep dive into kind of like a making of some of the most iconic ad campaigns in our industry. And we want to talk about that, definitely. But before we get into some of those nuts and bolts things, tell us a little about your background. You, as a journalist, you had a different path than a lot of the people that we've interviewed on our show. I was sharing with you before we hit the record button that I had a little bit of a journalism background in college and almost took that route. I had 2 job offers on the table when I had my first job opportunities right out of college, and did not take that route. And I've always wondered what might happen, but you did. So tell us a little bit about how you found your way to journalism, and then how your career in journalism, did it make a turn to creativity? Was this something you were always interested in? How did you find your way into the advertising world as your beat?
Yeah, well, I didn't really know I wanted to be a journalist at all. So I went to college thinking maybe political science or something. Ended up sort of pivoting over to becoming a literature major. And, like you, Howard, I fell into the student newspaper. I became the editor of my student newspaper, and this was at Washington University in St. Louis. I didn't have, they didn't have a J school. Mizzou was the big J school, of course, out in Columbia, but we didn't have one. So any journalism training was going to have to be sort of on the job after hours, separate from my schoolwork. So, but I just, I fell in love with it, and I thought, wow, this is going to be the career for me. And was lucky enough to be the editor of the paper my senior year and had a blast. We had the 1992 presidential debate come to town. That took place on campus, and that was a big deal for us because we were allowed a bunch of seats in the auditorium as the student paper, and it was really kind of a heady time. And then I graduated and moved to New York, and decided let's give this journalism thing a try in the big city. So that's kind of what I did, but I didn't cover advertising or creativity at first at all. In fact, the first thing I covered probably couldn't have been further from that. It was the energy business, the oil and gas business, which is, by revenue, probably the biggest story in the world, but it wasn't really for me. I spent a few years as an editor, sort of exploring that business, made tons of friends who I still am friendly with today. But a few years into that job, I thought, I got to cover something that's more fun than this. I mean, not that, for some people, barrels per day and refinery news and everything else is the cat's meow. But for me, it was a little boring. So, I thought about what I want to cover. I did spend a little time at the Village Voice covering theater. I was drawn to creative arts generally. And then, I sort of looked at the landscape, and particularly around this time, which was mid to late 90s in New York, it was a glut of people covering the traditional arts like music and theater and movies and so on. So ended up at Adweek, where I thought, here's a business where, there's tons of creative people doing really interesting things. Doesn't get covered very seriously or even by many people. So I felt like it could be an opportunity to kind of be, I don't know, I guess a bigger fish in a smaller pond, perhaps, in terms of the creative arts. So yeah, started out there, and it was a great time to start in the 90s, late 90s. The very first commercial that I covered in any depth was Surfer, the Guinness commercial in '99, April of '99. And I just remember getting on the phone with Walter Campbell and just discussing that commercial, and I just sort of fell in love with covering this form of creativity, commercial creativity, and I've covered it ever since, really. And that's it's been a few years now, and I still love it. So for me, it was a great choice. And it beats the socks off of the energy business, in my opinion. Respect to my friends.
I can see that. What is your sense of the way you are received as a journalist among our folk? When you call up and you want to talk to a senior muckety muck at a big agency, are they eager to talk to you?
Well, they're on their best behavior probably when they talk to me. I've always, I realize that the business can be difficult. It can be full of a lot of, of sort of difficult personalities and difficult behaviors. I'm shielded from some of that because, the people that I speak to often, want something from me. They want some coverage. They want to be included. Obviously, the press plays a fairly big role in the advertising business. It leads directly to business if you're covered. So everybody in the industry tends to want some press, which is, it's a nice position to be in, to have your calls picked up and to have those connections be fairly easy to make. But I am, my job is to be removed from the industry too. So I need to be able to be critical. I need to be able to be, to ask difficult questions, or, cover things that maybe they don't want covered, stuff like that. But on the flip side, in covering creativity, a big part of my job is just to cover new campaigns, and those are not particularly controversial. It's not news per se; it's just new work that needs us to dig into it and to present it. So, I wouldn't say a lot of my job is really contentious, but I am friendly with a lot of folks in the industry. I do have a lot of access, which is nice. But it's it is journalism too. Like we need to cover the difficult things that are happening in the business too, and I think we do that pretty well at AdAge. So it's a nice mix. But yeah, I think I'm received with open arms usually.
You mentioned, you kind of alluded to one of the ironies of our business, which is you were talking about, how you started out and you wanted to cover something creative, and advertising is very much in the pop culture, right? Like everybody's exposed to it, everybody's sees advertising, but it also is a very niche industry in terms of the people that work in it, and very little understood about our industry by lay people outside. So like as a trade publication, AdAge, right, has a very pretty narrow audience. Just the people that work in the industry. I've always kind of marveled at that irony about like how the product itself touches so many people, but the inner workings of how things work in an ad agency are really something that only the people that work in it know.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, what's interesting to me from my perspective, working on this side of it, is what you're saying is true, and our audience is quite small, particularly since AdAge and Adweek as well have gone mostly behind a paywall. When I was at Adweek, for, geez, I started there in '99 and ended up working there for almost 20 years, and for the majority of that time, the website was free to read. So I remember stories in the early 2010s, at the height of the viral video craze, before YouTube, sort of monetized that, turned it into a business where you could actually earn tens of millions of views on an ad, which is hard to do now without paying for it. Our stories about some of these ads, would reach, I had a story get 15 million views in 2013. So our trade publication stories would sometimes reach a mass audience, which speaks to, you know, the popularity and the culture of some of the product that this industry makes. Now that we're behind a paywall, you know, it's journalism. It's a bit of a tough time for journalism, so we're all searching for the model that's going to allow us to stay afloat and to survive. And these subscription models really help us. But you know, the downside is we don't reach as many folks, but we do reach the people in the business that's our core audience anyway.
I've always questioned, and not just with regard to our industry trade publications, but with things like the New York Times, my local paper, the Miami Herald, the paywall. I don't understand how it can be, why it couldn't be that you simply see a 15 or 30-second advertisement before you get to read an article. If you have 100 years worth of articles, that's worth something. And very few people who are interested, unless they're researching something specifically professionally, are going to pay for that article. But if you tell me, hey, watch this 30-second commercial, and then you'll be able to read the article. Seems like it works okay for YouTube to do it with videos. I don't understand why it can't be done for print articles on text on the web, but that's just a comment. I don't know that it necessarily requires an answer on your part. I just I always think it's kind of, I understand the desire to monetize and say, you know, we're not giving it away for free, but I don't think you have to give it away for free. I think, and the whole premise of advertising, by the way, of our industry is that people want content, but they'd rather have Crest toothpaste subsidize it than themselves, you know, or Tide detergent. So anyway.
Yeah, I mean, you know, for us, it's not either or. We do, you know, a big part of our revenue still comes from advertising. We have sponsors that you know, we're happy to have. We do have some pre-roll. It's funny, people always complain about having to see an ad to watch another ad, which is a unique pre-roll situation on some of the ad trades. But listen, it's not necessarily that easy to make the numbers work in our business. So unfortunately, we have to paywall a lot of our product. But you know, a lot of folks in the industry, I think, see the value in it and are happy to pay for it. I know there's some password sharing going on, and that's probably comes with the territory. But yeah, I think you know, I think journalism got itself in trouble at the beginning of the internet, giving everything away for free, or you know, even some ad supported stuff. But yeah, the model's working for us now, so we're pretty happy with it.
You know, as I was alluding before, Tim, I had that option very early in my adult life to make the choice into journalism, and I didn't take it. So I've always had a very healthy respect and admiration for journalists, and I know that the profession, and it's not unique to journalism, but the profession has suffered the slings and arrows of outrageous rage, and has, in many people's eyes, has plummeted in esteem. How have you coped with the perceptions out there that of journalism, or have you been able to, has working in the creative industry provided a bit of a shield for you in that regard?
Well, you know, yeah, I think trade journalism is probably a little different than mass journalism. I mean, there's plenty of mass publications that I respect. I think, you know, sure, I think TV news has contributed to a lot of the divisiveness in the country, probably. But you know, covering a certain industry, I think I probably am shielded from some of that, and we can just kind of focus on how to serve this industry best, how to really help people understand what's happening in the industry, what it means. You know, there's enormous change going on in this industry at the moment, and change has been a constant for the last 20 years, really, in advertising. So, you know, we're there to sort of try to understand it on your behalf and to try to share our learnings with you. So in many ways, you know, we do provide sort of a service journalism in that way. You know, it's my job to sort of, as creativity editor, is to really analyze the creative work and to try to explain why I think something's good or why I think something's lacking, and what it means more broadly for the industry. So, yeah, at least in my position, I'm pretty happy to be a journalist, and I feel like it's an exciting job for me. I get to cover many campaigns in a given week, and just moving from one to another is quite refreshing to see how, amid all the headwinds that advertisers have these days, to see some of the more clever, entertaining, even sort of moving stuff coming out. Week to week, it's never boring.
How have we, the creatives in the industry, responded or treated you and your critiques of what we do? What kind of emails and texts and do you get angry? Do you get angry
Not,
messages?
not so much. I don't usually pan things for the sake of it. If I don't like something, often I'll just move on. I think my job is really to sort of dig into what I do like, and hopefully that provides a bit of direction for people. It wasn't always this way. I think we had in probably 2004 to 2008 or 9, when I was at Adweek and we launched our Ad Freak blog, which was, kind of an amusing, we would have more of a snarky attitude. I think it was sort of that Gawker era where we felt like we had to tee off on things we didn't like. And we certainly got a bit more pushback on that stuff. And of course, Agency Spy. I'm sure you guys remember the heyday of Agency Spy with a lot of difficult comments. The comment section was quite lively, so that was more. Listen, there's a lot of animosity in the business here and there, so people need to vent that somewhere, apparently. But we've long since not had comments. Adweek doesn't have comment section anymore. AdAge doesn't have a comment section, so we're not the sort of venue for that anymore. I think the Fishbowls of the world sort of serve that purpose. But people are generally, I think, people are happy when we pay attention to something in a serious way. Like, it's nice for advertising creatives to see their work sort of taken seriously and thought about and commented on. I think it's rare in many cases, and I'm privileged enough to sort of be in that position where I can, if I like something, I can share it with the industry and say why I like it. And that's, more than half my job is saying nice things about great work. So that's a nice position to be in, and I get a lot of grateful folks as a result of that, which is nice.
So I think that's a good segue to talk about Tagline, which I'm guessing was your creation or your brainchild when you were with Clio. Talk to us a little bit about the genesis of the podcast, and then we could talk a little bit about like some of the episodes that come to mind as for those who don't know, it's a podcast basically about the making of some of the most iconic advertising in recent memory. It's like a behind the scenes, very entertaining, as well as informative, kind of like if you like the kind of stuff, the in-depth stuff that you would see on This American Life, or here on This American Life on NPR or something like that. It's that level of, I think, production quality and investigation and interviewing and editing that goes into it, or went into it, as it's no longer currently active. But just wanted to give us a little bit of the history of the podcast itself, and then some insight about surprising things you may have learned along the way, and what some favorite moments might have been.
Yeah, well, thanks for saying that about the show. It was really fun, and where it started was actually Clio was celebrating its 60th anniversary in 2019. So they'd been around since '59, and as I was in charge of content for Clio, so we had our site Mused by Clio, and as we started discussing, what kind of content are we going to have to celebrate the 60th. One idea was to sort of revisit some of these campaigns and just, find one person that worked on it and just get a memory from them. So that's what we did. I think we picked 13, 14 campaigns, something like that. And we reached out and we found a single person for each one. And we just, got a few paragraphs of their reminiscences of what it was like. And just from contacting a single person on a campaign, we got some really wild stories, I think, that we'd never like heard before. And it wasn't just me, it was some of my colleagues at Clio too. We were sort of all doing this as a project together. And that sort of, I started thinking, wow, if we can get this much out of just talking to one person, what are we going to get if we sort of, find as many as people as we can? So the very first episode that I recorded, or that I sort of started researching to do first, which actually didn't air until later on in the first season, but it was the Johnny Walker, Robert Carlyle, The Man Who Walked Around the World film, which BBH had made in London in 2009. Jamie Raffin was the director. And I started out with 4 people on that. I spoke to Jamie, I spoke to Justin Moore, who was the copywriter, Ruben Mercadal, who was the producer, Kate Owen, who's the editor, and did a bunch of interviews with them. And then I thought, can I stitch this into like a mini documentary where I can sort of tell the story in my own voice and just fold in audio, not just from the interviewees, but from the work itself. And that particular film was a great starting point, because the film itself is just enjoyable to listen to if you just listen to the audio track. Justin was a great interview. Jamie Raffin they were all wonderful to talk to. And for me, it became this puzzle, right? So I did 4 pretty lengthy interviews, probably hour long each. I had 4 documents, pretty long documents. And then my job was to really try to tell the story and just take bits and pieces from each of these interviews and tell the story. And I was able to put together, what I thought was a pretty good 45 minutes kind of telling the story. And then, as this was sort of to prove to myself that this project was kind of viable, that I could do it. First of all, I wasn't sure I was capable of doing it. And it to this day, it remains kind of the most difficult. I mean, these episodes were really hard to do.
To do it at that level.
Yeah.
So if a couple of things just to point out while you were talking, I'm reminded of the fact that I first became aware of that Johnny Walker film probably in 2012. The agency I was at Alma DDB in Miami. I worked on the McDonald's business on the Hispanic side, and we got an RFP to pitch Buchanan's whiskey, which is another Diageo brand, and we were in a series of presentations. And at one of the after one of the presentations, the whiskey portfolio manager walked up to me and he says, "Listen, I love what you guys are doing for Buchanan's." We hadn't won the pitch yet. It's like, "I love what you guys are doing for Buchanan's, but I need you to do something for me for Johnny Walker right away." And so we actually picked up 2 pieces of business at once, which was really nice, both whiskey brands in the Diageo portfolio. But part of the grounding in the brand was that video. And as an ad person, you watch that the first time and it's like you're blown away, which leads me to the second thought, that as someone who's always been a history buff, applying kind of the same level of investigation and storytelling to these major campaigns is really, really entertaining for a history buff if you work in advertising, because the subject matter is dear to my heart. But I also love those inner workings of what went on. And it's interesting, we just had John Steele, the author of Truth, Lies, and Advertising.
Sure, yeah.
And we were talking about how campaigns are presented, that they went down versus how they really went down. There's usually a chasm between those things. And I think the benefit of a podcast like the one you had was that in subsequent years, people's guards are down and they're free to tell the true story of
so true.
How it almost didn't happen, how the client might have been difficult, or how a client not liking one thing ended up them going in a totally different direction, and that's how they ended up. Sometimes getting rejected isn't the worst thing. Like, you went back to the drawing board and came up with an iconic campaign.
For sure. No, I remember, I think before, when we were discussing about having this interview, we talked about the Dove Real Beauty sketches. And that was, I never had the full picture of what that relationship between Ogilvy and Dove was like right before that. They were Erica Hoholik, who came over to be the worldwide lead on Dove at Ogilvy. She was quite honest about the relationship was completely broken, and she had 3 months to fix it. And it was a long way from, when the campaign for Real Beauty had started, 8 years before. So yeah, you're right. I mean, it's sometimes these folks can speak more freely. But what was amazing too for me about the Johnny Walker film was that was made it was made internally for Diageo salespeople. It was an internal video. It was never supposed to be external. And what BBH did with that and made it so artful. And also it turned what's usually the most boring part of a brand's website, like the About Us history page, into something just phenomenal. So the degree of difficulty of that one and what it was intended to do and how it exceeded what it was intended to do by so much. And then of course, just the craft of it, like learning. My only regret there is that Robert Carlyle didn't come on the show, which I would have loved to have heard him. But eventually I did blow it out. I did the 4 interviews initially, but then I got the composer because the music's such a big piece. George Richmond came on, who was the DP on that, who had done Children of Men with Alfonso Cuarón, which was important because, it's in a single take film. He had watched, or he had worked on with Cuarón on the crazy single shot scene in the middle of Children of Men. So just the craft of it was amazing. And, I started to realize once I did the Johnny Walker one that this was a format that could work as long as I was willing to put in the hours to do these, because man, it is a puzzle trying to tease out a narrative out of what ended up on some of these episodes being 10, 12 pretty long interview transcripts. You never really, you watch a documentary on TV and you never really realize what goes into it. And man, it took me a long time to put some of these together.
I was just going to say, for a lot of the people that you interview, because you're talking about like, these are like some of the most iconic executions or campaigns that for them, it's a highlight of their career. So that it's something that they cherish those stories. And I would imagine that they're willing, to open up about them, given the fact, hey, I worked on this thing and it's this thing that everybody recognizes as
Well, the one funny sort of dynamic that emerged in a lot of these interviews was that often the people I was interviewing hadn't actually watched the thing in a while, and they watched it to prepare for the interview usually. And, it's funny how often they would say, I don't usually look back and like anything I've done, but I actually liked this. That's what Justin Moore said of the Johnny Walker thing. He said, usually I only look back and see the flaws, but I think we did a pretty good job with this one, which was, it was nice to sort of see their reactions upon not having seen something in quite a while too.
Go ahead, Howard. Sorry.
I was just, I have my favorite episodes. And by the way, I just want to remind our viewers that the podcast is still available for people to go back and listen to. It's on my podcast host. And I forget how many total episodes you have, but I mean, when we knew you were coming on the show, Tim, I went back and listened to the Dove documentary, and I know they're all there. So even though you're not making new episodes, this archive, it's an archive now of some great history.
25 episodes is what I saw.
25, yeah, and you can get them all. I think if you go to taglinepodcast.com, you can see them all there.
Yeah, that's I was just visiting just before you called in. What's remarkable for me is that inside detail, the stuff you couldn't possibly know that comes out in these conversations, the little things that you'll learn. I mean, Henry was alluding to that inside stuff. And for me, for example, when I was listening to the episode on the I'm a Mac campaign, with
Justin Long,
and what's his name?
John Hodgman,
John Hodgman. And interesting, I just saw him on an episode of Battlestar Galactica. I said, oh my God, that's John Hodgman. Was the fact that, and this may be well known to others, but it was a new bit of information for me, that Steve Jobs insisted that all the spots be shot. He wasn't going to make a decision just looking at the scripts. He was smart enough, experienced enough,
and had enough money.
and had enough money exactly to say, I can't judge if this is going to be funny by looking at but the words on the page.
To
I
be
want to see
fair,
this.
the setups weren't that elaborate or expensive to do,
Well,
Sure, yeah, they could
multiple.
try some
yeah.
things, yeah.
Yeah.
And that gets back to an argument that Henry and I've had a couple of times about should a creative brief include the budget? And that campaign to me is an example of it was just two guys on a white screen.
Hmm.
So it cost nothing essentially, comparatively speaking. But
Hmm.
that little tidbit was very revealing to me. And obviously some clients have the bucks to do it and most don't. But
Hmm.
and I don't know, I'm going to grab a number from memory that may be wrong. So help me out here. I think they said that they produced 92 spots, of which they aired only maybe 2/3. Am I close?
It was way more. So I think they produced 66 total in the end, but they shot over 200, I think.
Oh, okay. Well, I just remember
Yeah,
that there were many, many more that were shot.
yeah, for sure.
And who knows, even with just two guys on a screen, it wasn't cheap, but
Well,
relatively
and
speaking, it was
those
cheap.
spots, the ones that never aired, they exist somewhere.
Mm, wow.
And I've spoken with folks where I've been trying to get my hands on those for I don't know how long, like 10 years. And I don't think they'll ever see the light of day because, Apple is Apple and
Yeah.
they tightly control everything. But man, I would love to just check them out. I've heard that some of the plots of a few of them. I think Zach Galifianakis plays Santa Claus in one of them, which I can only imagine that they used to do those holiday spots and
Right.
amazing that you could pay Zach Galifianakis to come in and shoot something that everyone on set kind of thinks is awesome, and then Steve says no at the end. Like, how frustrating is that? If you're working on that campaign, you must have you must develop sort of a Teflon personality to not be bothered by that because
Well, that leads me to the question. You're an outsider looking in, and maybe like a lot of us, you're a wannabe creative. I mean, everyone out there thinks they're a writer, thinks they're an art director. You clearly are a writer because you're a journalist. But if you truly had aspirations to be in the industry, maybe you would have done something. That still doesn't mean that you haven't got a good eye for good work. So as a journalist with a little bit of an arm's length distance between what we do and your reporting on it, what can you tell us about us as creatives? What have you learned about what creatives are like, what we do, how we think, how we solve problems? Do we do it as well as you think we could do it? What are some of your insights?
yeah, sure. I mean, listen, I think a lot of wonderful work comes out of this industry, and I think I naturally am drawn to the best work, and I speak to the people that are doing the best work. Obviously, probably a majority of work that's produced in this industry is not great. It's difficult to watch in many cases. I don't know. I've always been fascinated with where ideas come from, which is kind of a ridiculous question. Like, who knows? Whenever I would interview people about a campaign, I'd say where did this idea come from? As if they knew. It sort of just emerges from their entire experience. But trying to capture that of like how people's prior experiences or references pop up in the work. I've always found that to be sort of fascinating. And yeah, I mean, it's I've also been interested in how the dynamic. What I find interesting about advertising creatives in particular is there's no question the talent in these folks, but you've got this dynamic where the client gets to decide, and it's that probably dictates how passionate you can get about your work, right? Like if you're too passionate, I've met many people in advertising who said, you can't get too into stuff because you're going to be disappointed or it's going to be an uphill battle. So in a lot of the best creatives that I've seen, they don't get too attached to their work, which I think is different than artists or musicians, where they're free to sort of indulge their muse however they like. So I think that's an interesting dynamic. Exploring the personalities in the industry, knowing that you can't really be it's not yours what you're making really, which I think is kind of fascinating. But the best folks who in the industry, I think, are ones that sort of are okay with that, and sort of thrive in spite of those restrictions, I suppose. And then I also think what's interesting is there's this layer in the business too of there's creatives and then there's creative directors, and it's a little different, right? Like if you look at like a David Lubar's, for example, who just recently retired, like what an incredible creative director. Not that he wasn't a wonderful creative himself, but he'll admit, he wasn't necessarily the greatest writer in the world, but he was able to get things done and he had a business mind. And so sort of looking at folks, some of the most, look at like a David Droga, like what a unicorn that guy was, like such an incredible talent as a creative. And now he's the CEO of Accenture Song. Like that's kind of wild that those two skill sets can exist within the same person. So, to me, that's another thing that's kind of fascinating about this industry. It's got the business side and it's got the creative side, and seeing how they mix,
We've
it's pretty fascinating.
we've addressed both of those topics here on the podcast. The first being the difference between being a great creative and being a great creative director, because the roles are different. Leading, managing other people, and budgets and timelines and things like that. That's a management role.
Sure.
But you have to have that skill of understanding good creativity in order to get it done, and mentoring and teaching. And then there's the business side along with the creative side, like a guy like Bill Bernbach, right? Like, no doubt he was a brilliant creative and creative director, but he also had a knack for business.
Sure.
And those are unicorns, but that's what makes them like the giants of the industry that we revere today. I want to get back real quick to some of the episodes of the Tagline podcast. I don't want to make the whole episode about Tagline, but it is such a kind of like available resource, and you did put a lot of hours and effort into it. Which was the one that you were most surprised by, like how deep it went,
Mm-hmm.
and which was just kind of your all around favorite to put together?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I have a lot of favorites. One that I found really fascinating was Motel 6.
Ooh.
The Tom Bodett stuff, like just talking to those guys that wrote those spots in the 1980s. I mean, what an interesting, such a simple thing. First of all, radio campaigns are wonderful for podcasts because that's the entire product you can get into your podcast. And there were so many of
And
those.
no one wants to do radio today, which just boggles my
Mhm.
mind. As a writer, that is the writer's fantasy world. I just throw that in because I've been reading about that lately. So that's why I love
Yeah.
this story
It's
about Motel 6.
and it's still like the biggest reach medium out there
Yeah.
is like, boring radio, but people still listen to it. It's not
Yeah.
flashy,
Yeah.
and it has limitations, right? Having no visual has limitations. But I'm happy that you mentioned the Motel 6 one, because I remember, I don't remember the exact time, but I remember hearing those commercials, and it was always like Tom Bodett for Motel 6. And I didn't know who Tom Bodett was, but I felt like I should know by the way that he kind of, hey, I'm Tom Bodett. And then you kind of just figured out, oh, this guy is like a homespun humorist. And
Hmm.
he's been chosen as the spokesperson, and his humor goes on. And then, you get all the inside story from the podcast. It's also interesting because there's another episode about Real Men of Genius, which began as Real American Heroes, which began as a radio campaign. And actually, I'm happy to call one of the creators of that, Bill Cimino, a friend. um and so radio for me has always been one of those that I remember. There was a campaign for Comp USA, and they had a long running radio campaign. It was PC Modem and Bob. I don't know if you remember these, but
I
it
don't remember
was
that.
it was a campaign where PC Modem was like a nerdy guy, and then Bob was like a stand-up comedian, and so one was a straight guy, and there was always like some sort of punchline. And I remember one of the punchlines was, um, he says, "Oh, that's the greatest thing I've heard since they found, what was the name of the guy that robbed the bank and jumped out of the plane? Now I'm blanking on his name.
I
Uh,
know who you're talking about, but I can't think of his
Mhm.
name either.
yeah, and he goes, they never caught him, and he goes, well, then it's the greatest thing I ever heard. You know, those, to make a campaign that sticks with you after 30 years, a radio campaign,
Mhm.
there's definitely a talent there. So
Yeah, I mean, I just love, first of all, when you have Tom Bodett was, gracious enough to come on the show, and he's just such a, you can just listen to that guy talk. He's got that folksy humor. He was so fun to listen to. Just having that tape of him was, I knew we were gonna have a good episode. And yeah, the Real Men of Genius one too. Like just digging into radio campaigns was really fun. One that I found really interesting too, that was the Skittles episode, where I didn't really know much about the history of that campaign, and a big piece of that I think early on was the strategy. So I spoke to the strategist, and I sort of got this really interesting, what I felt was a really interesting insight into the Chiat team in 2004, sort of exploring what teenage life was like then, right? Like Skittles, prior to that campaign, had really targeted their advertising at like much younger children, which the agency was confused about because teenagers eat more candy than younger kids do. So they started targeting teenagers, and teenagers had changed a lot around that time because the advent of the internet had sort of, they were growing up faster, and there was all this sort of interesting content around that they were being drawn to at the time, like the Fatboy Slim music video with Christopher Walken on the walls, and
dancing,
there
yeah.
there was all this very like absurdist stuff. But I think the breakthrough in that campaign was, it wasn't just like completely wacky stuff happening. Like if you look at those old Skittles ads, they sort of came up with rules for them, and one of the rules was there can only be one piece of magic happening in an otherwise very mundane environment. And I thought that was a pretty fascinating way to approach it. And what the way that it was explained to me was that teenagers are sort of stuck between like the magic of childhood and the reality of adulthood. And those spots, by presenting the reality of adulthood and mixing in like a piece of magic from childhood, almost like creatively, it sort of embodied the target in a weird way, and it embodied the product, because the product was a very sort of multi-sensory, if you could almost think about it as hallucinatory in a way. So like the whole strategy, how it pertained to culture, how it pertained to the product, how it pertained to the target, those things all dovetailed in such a strange way in that campaign. And so I felt like that episode, we did probably the best job that we had done of sort of encapsulating why that creative approach came to be, more so than some other episodes. So I'm really fond of that one, and that also spanned 20 years, because we also, towards the end of that episode, we dug into the stuff Ari Weiss did at DDB much later, like the
Uh,
Broadway the Rainbow, the Broadway musical that they put on. So that episode really started in 2004, but it ended in like 2019 or so. So that was interesting too.
I was about to say that not only was it then a great campaign, but it's a campaign that continues to this day. Just a couple months ago received a brief from Mars Confectionery Division for Skittles, and with all the guidelines and all the this is the campaign, and so it's very much still alive today. And
Yeah.
to me, it's one of the interesting things about advertising is sometimes the campaigns outlive the agency relationship. New agency comes in, and I'm a big fan actually of when an agency comes in and recognizes the genius of what came before,
Hmm.
but gives it a new look, a fresh take on what came before. To me, that if I were a marketer, if I were a CMO, that's what I'd be looking for in an agency, particularly if I had a legacy campaign, something that I was known
Hmm.
for. A tagline is like, why walk away from all that equity? Let's refresh it. Let's relook at it. And I think we see that with, you know, a lot of the long running campaigns. You know, the ideas themselves tend not to age at all. There was an interesting thing that came out. It's got to be a dozen years ago already. It was something called Google Project Rebrief. Did you ever
Hmm.
see that?
Sure.
It
Yep.
was a really phenomenal documentary where they went into like some of the iconic ad campaigns, and they got those old creatives
Hmm.
out of retirement and sat them down with young creatives to say, well, tell us about the campaign. And it's very similar to Tagline in that sense, where they talked about, well, this is what we were thinking, and then they came up with like new modern, you know, internet ways of, you know, I remember the mountaintop commercial for Coca-Cola, right? I'd like to buy the world
Yep.
of Coke.
Sure. Hilltop.
And
Yeah.
and it in Hilltop, and it inspired an idea that well, what if we make a vending machine here where you can buy a soda for somebody in Africa, and that person receives there's another vending machine over there, like you could pay, and
Hmm.
all connected through the internet. And it's literally the modern day interpretation of I'd like to buy the world of Coke. And
Yeah.
so it just goes to show you the power of the underlying ideas. Unfortunately, one of the drawbacks of our industry, and one of the pet peeves I have, is that people are quick to throw away
Mm.
things when
Well, people
it's
have to own. People like feel like they come in and they have to own a new thing, right? It's like, well, if we continue with what happened before, then that was their success, and I can't take credit, and that's a problem in the industry for sure. Is like people just needing to take credit and wanting to own things, and you know, I get it. It's a bit of a cutthroat business, but yeah, if you can have the confidence to sort of stick with something that's working, you know, a good example there, I think, and another one of the episodes I liked was the very first one we actually published, which was the Dos Equis Most Interesting Man campaign. Which, first of all, many things I learned from that episode. Not least of which was how smart the client was. I think some of these episodes really come alive when the client talks, which is, you know, counter to what many creatives would assume. Also, I had several episodes where the account person was the smartest person in the room. You know, like if you go back and listen to the Volkswagen, you know, Little Vader spot, the woman who was the account lead on that campaign was just absolutely the smartest of any of them, and it's great to see that. But you know, the most interesting man, you know, they got rid of Jonathan after a few years, and like why? You know, they were looking at different demographics maybe for what that character should be, and you know that was a difficult idea to get across the finish line at the very beginning, right? Because you know a beer marketers typically when they want to, you know, target 21 to 34 year olds, they don't like, why would you have a 75-year-old man sort of as your ad star, right? Like the talent doesn't necessarily have to reflect the target market. So
oh, a a
I
100%.
mean,
I think
yeah, look at Wendy's. Look at the Wendy's campaign, you know?
yeah,
yeah,
for sure.
but I think that the nature of the humor was what appealed to that
Mm.
demographic, right? Like the one-liners, and the fact that that campaign, like it's another beautiful thing about advertising, like Most Interesting Man in the, or I'm sorry, like Real Men of Genius. The Once you're, as a consumer, understand the premise, you can almost write your own scripts. Like
Yeah.
there's a formula there, and that you know what the humor is, you know what it is. And Real Men of Genius is still parodied and kind of copied, and people use it
Yeah.
to kind of demonstrate, like, oh, look at this guy, Mr. whatever, whatever. But I love the Dos Equis campaign because I love campaigns where you can honestly look at it and say the only thing that changed from this brand being nowhere to this brand being a mega brand
Mm.
is the advertising. And that was the case for Dos Equis. Dos Equis was a beer that had been sold in the United States since like the mid 80s. And from what I saw, they had a very small budget that they would kind of pool and spend around Cinco de Mayo, and that was it. Like there'd be like some in-store promo. You might get a commercial, but it was a very small brand with a very small budget that activated around a Mexican holiday, and suddenly they created this campaign that became a cultural touchstone for this audience, right? For, suddenly everybody was like laughing and wondering what was going to be the next thing. The other thing that I found genius about that particular campaign was that what you're seeing on screen wasn't a see and say of what was being said. So you'd have them talking about the most interesting man in the world doing something, but what we're seeing is him wrestling a lion, which isn't what the guy is like.
Right.
So it was just kind of this idea of, we could throw together interesting footage of this guy, doing different outlandish things, and then we can mix and match that with whatever voiceover we want, as long as it meets the requirements of the formula of the campaign, which to me strikes me as a pretty cost-effective way of putting together, because you could recycle footage, you could use outtakes from one shoot and the next commercial, because it doesn't all have to match up.
Yeah. Well, and the director used sort of old cameras to get that funky look on a lot of the footage and that stuff. And yeah, as far as the target, they found a nice spot in between like Budweiser and Heineken, right? Budweiser was sort of the time like the
Frat boys.
frat boy stuff, and Heineken was sort of like for the golf crowd, and they found this sort of middle ground where there was these these young men that wanted to sort of be taken a little more seriously, and they had a bit more of a sophisticated, I don't know if that's the word, but sense of humor. And yeah, and just again, the characters in that, the client was amazing in that episode. Jonathan was good enough to come on and talk about it. There was a very bizarre story at one of the sets. There was a bear. The bear got loose at one of the shoots early on. Like that episode really. And again, it's largely a radio. It wasn't largely, but it worked really well as a because it's really the one-liners. That you wanted. The music was amazing. The guy from Frontline did the voiceovers.
That's right. They give it like a very documentary, serious feel, very deadpan. I mean, the whole thing, it just all really, really came together. And you mentioned the clients, and I want to say that because we all have our horror stories about clients, and there are a lot of clients out there that you wonder how the hell they ever got the job. But these great campaigns, like every time I hear about bad advertising, I put the blame on the client, because somebody had to approve the bad ad, right? But the reverse is true. When something is brilliant, somebody had to see the brilliance in it and approve it. And approving a brilliant ad isn't always the easiest thing. It's easier to approve the milquetoast, middle of the road idea that isn't going to offend anybody, isn't going to ruffle any feathers, but it also isn't going to put a brand like Dos Equis on the map and make it like one of the most important import beer brands in the country.
1000%. And when they first, I think when the clients, because there were several clients, right? There was two beer organizations, because Heineken was the importer, but then there was the Mexican brewery too. And those guys, when they saw the first, because they had shot, I think, the first commercial, and they didn't really understand it at all. And there was a big showdown between the CMO and the CEO, and that work almost never saw the light of day, which is crazy.
I bet they didn't question it afterwards.
Well, for sure. Well, it's like the Skittles, right? Like I remember Jerry Graff telling me that they didn't know, they almost killed those early scripts too. And then in year 2 or year 3, one of the clients told the agency, "We don't think these are weird enough." So it was a complete 180. Like suddenly as soon as you get a taste of sales and success from a campaign, it doesn't matter how weird you thought it was at first.
That's an interesting point, real quick, Howard, is that sometimes it actually takes a little bit, or the second iteration of a campaign, for it to take hold. I'm very fond of talking about 2006 when Wyden pitched Old Spice, which was a dead brand, and through a strategist forum, I was able to obtain the deck that Wyden presented, basically to reposition Old Spice, and it's brilliant. But the very first few executions weren't the ones that later came into public consciousness. So it kind of took them a couple of swings at bat in order
Yep.
to hit the right note. Which is to me also an interesting angle about advertising. Sometimes it's not right
Yeah.
out of the chute successful, but
Yeah.
eventually does catch
I feel like
fire.
maybe it was the Bruce Campbell stuff that finally got kind of noticed. Remember, he was, the guy from what was that movie? The Sam Raimi movie, Evil Dead. Evil Dead. I think his, he was that commercial where he was playing the piano. I think that was when they sort
Yeah,
of finally started doing good work.
I
yeah,
want to pivot to, what's kind of going on right here, right now. And, we're just coming down from the high or the semi-high of Cannes. And, one of the big topics today is, I'm sure is AI and its influence on creativity. And Toys R Us just dropped a spot within the last couple of days
They did,
that
yeah.
has been received a lot of pushback from the creative community. I've seen it. I think it's pretty awful. What's your take on this technology, and how do you respond to its impact and the way it's playing out in our industry and the way creatives are responding to it, the way agencies and brands are responding to it?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't write about that one. Adrian, my colleague Adrian, covered that. But obviously, I watched it. Yeah, I didn't think it was very good. I thought it was a little creepy. But listen, nothing's going to stop this technology, so we do have to sort of figure it out as an industry. I think there's, clearly and understandably a lot of fear around the technology replacing people's jobs, and certainly in certain parts of the vendor side, the production side, illustration jobs it's already really decimating certain parts of that business. But I think the truth is no one knows how well AI will be able to, reproduce what creative people do and on what timeline. So I think there's been some signs that it's certainly not there yet. I mean, if Toys R Us feels like this is, worth putting out into the world, that's their call. But I think a spot like that is reassuring in some ways that we're pretty far from being able to create what humans create. But I wouldn't sit back and say we're safe. I think if you imagine how much things change generally in a year or two or five, like if we could fast forward right now 5 years, I'd be really curious to see what kind of creativity AI can produce then. So yeah, I mean it's understandably sort of chilling to think about, but I don't think we have much of a choice. We kind of got to dive in and figure it out, and hopefully, hopefully the magic of the ideas that we come up with and how weird and imperfect they are, and how human they are, will protect folks' jobs in the industry. That's my hope. But I do understand the anxiety around it 100%. I mean, like when that Under Armour commercial came out, a few months ago, and it caused all that stir because, they had filmed the athlete and, sort of created a fair amount of, it was a mixed media piece. It wasn't truly an AI generated piece, but that caused a huge stir, particularly in the production community. I think the folks, directors, the folks who are executing versus ideating on a lot of this stuff are a little freaked out. But
but
it's incumbent upon all of us to sort of approach it together, I think, and not,
but this is the way life has always been, though, with technology, right? Like there's new technology comes out and makes certain jobs obsolete. There was so when I started in the business in 96, there was a service bureau we used to use called uh, uh ImageWorks. It had previously been called Typeworks because it was a place where you'd get typeset. And they'd come in, they'd pick up the zip disks and the jazz disks and all that for,
yep,
to go process the layouts. And the delivery driver, the urban legend was the delivery driver had been a typesetter, who didn't believe in the desktop publishing. He said it was a fad, and he went from having this highly coveted, skilled job that paid really well to becoming a delivery driver, because his skill became obsolete. So it's incumbent upon us to incorporate the new technology
yeah,
into our skill set. as we move forward. And it's always been that way. And, you know, getting back to the client, like you still got to sell it to the client, right? Like a human being has to do that. And so
yeah, but the clients are looking for efficiencies all over the place.
oh,
So
of course they are, but that's also you know, that's also an excuse to do shitty work, you know, like it's a real reason for why we get such shitty work.
well, that's my
Well,
fear
I mean,
though, is that shitty work will be acceptable if it saves enough money.
but that's always going to be the case. I mean, you were alluding to it before, Tim, that the vast majority of advertising out there and always has been sucky. And, you know, Henry and I talk about the bell curve effect. The bell curve applies to everything. 99.9% of what we see out there, and most of us don't see it, is crap. It's the 1%, the stuff that you know goes to Cannes and wins awards. But even that doesn't guarantee that it's the most effective.
Right.
I think part of the problem in advertising is that it's hard to put results back to advertising, right? We were just talking about like Dos Equis, where clearly they didn't change the formula. The distribution, if anything, was very weak. It became stronger because the advertising created demand for the product. So, but in most cases with established brands, it's hard to kind of put you know, we put this much in advertising and we got this much back. And so what ends up happening is you end up, you know, accepting substandard advertising. It's not moving the needle, frankly. And then you get these budget, you know, incremental budget cuts each year of 2 to 3%. And you're basically killing the brand off by 1,000 cuts. And my argument to any client who's thinking that way would be, well, you know what, when you hire an attorney, you could hire an attorney that bills at $500 an hour, or you could hire an attorney that bills at $150 an hour. Who do you want representing you if it's your ass on the line? Like, and so, you know, unfortunately, there's just a lot of mediocrity in corporate America. But there will always be a standout few clients, marketers, advertising, brand managers that want to make a mark, that believe in the power of creativity. And so that'll always give them an advantage in this field of a lot of, you know, just noise advertising. And the fact is, it's not that most advertising is horrible. It's just that it's there. It's just background noise.
Right.
Which is almost worse than, like, you know, some horrible advertising actually makes them, like, you remember Head On, apply directly to forehead.
Sure.
Like that was terrible, but it broke through.
Memorably terrible, yeah.
In a certain way. So anyway, that's my soapbox moment.
Well, Tim, put on your prognosticating hat, pull out your crystal ball, and let's talk for a moment. We'll kind of wrap up this conversation. As a journalist looking at our industry, what do you see in the next few years? What seems to be standing out to you in terms of where we're going, what we're going to be doing, maybe what we'll be discarding?
Well, I think we touched on AI. I think that is such a big piece of it at the moment. You know, beyond that, I think it's just about different strategies for the channels that we have. You know, like, you know, interactive. What's the future of TV? How does TV work? You know, some really interesting themes that I think I saw, like at Cannes this year. You know, the DoorDash campaign from Wyden really cut through, and I think that's an interesting use of TV. It's like, you know, Wyden and Kennedy, such a you know, so well known for the big sort of emotional brand anthems. It seems like they're moving more towards like functional TV advertising, that, you know, trying to get people to act in the moment. You know, like that's what that DoorDash thing was. A lot of what McDonald's has been doing. Like when I think about like modern advertising, it's way less about just sort of creating a feeling. It seems to be more about creating an action. And I think you'll see more and more of that. Like, you know, I think clients want that. You know,
moving away from the emotional connection.
Well, to a degree, I think the TV, particularly in TV work. But you know, I think the trend over the last couple of years has been like, you know, performance-based advertising, like at the expense of brand work. And I think that ship is turning around. I think that there's way more of a mix between the two now. So I think keeping an eye on that, like how much, you know, performance stuff versus brand work is being done. And then just, how whether crazy, silly ideas can survive these days. Like, I think COVID was a really difficult time for the business, and in terms of mindset and approach, like, thankfully humor is coming back, and not just humor. I feel like silliness has to come back. So, like, I think people just want, it's a difficult world. Things only seem to be getting worse on a number of fronts in the world, and people just want some relief from that, and brands that are playful, brands that are in culture, but not really, not to blare a message, but just sort of to take part in a way that feels sort of fun. Those brands, I think, are going to be successful. I see so many advertisers that sort of, they get it half right, like they give you a spot that's like kind of fun, but it's also just way heavy on the clunky as far as like what the message is and it's so clear that they're trying to get you to buy this thing. Or I just wish more advertisers would fully go in and just say, we're going to be a character in this larger story that these people are having, and we're not going to let our strategy show. We're not going to, I don't know, just authentic. I know authentic's a ridiculously overused word, but just being in culture in a way that feels like it brings some value to the audience. And so, even today, like, so few ad campaigns do that, like you have to sit through them, or you have to, I think the goal of any advertiser is to be in the consumer's life in a way that feels like a decent value exchange. And it still doesn't happen often, that you feel like it was worth it for you as a viewer to go through that. But we have all these different places we can play now as advertisers, and I feel like just looking at some of the great work from the past year, it can be done. It's a confusing marketplace, but man, if you just take your foot off the gas a little bit and just realize that people want something fun to interact with, and they don't want to be just sort of talked to. I don't know. My thoughts are clearly not fully coalesced on this stuff, but those are some things that I think advertisers need to think about.
I
Well,
I I have thought long and hard that, one of the Mark Ritson will say that Ad Age and all the other industry trades have a death fascination, like always talking about the death of this, the death of
Yeah, the
that.
death of the 30-second spot. It's been an
And
annual feature.
and I agree, and I tend to agree with him that all those death things are overblown. And you're right, like there's still some advertisers out there that are proving that it can be done, but you've got to be willing to take those risks. You got to be that client that is going to stand up there and take the slings and the arrows. But
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
you compare something like DoorDash, what they did on the Super Bowl, which was, really interesting, like contacting all those other brands and trying to, or you could do like just a random 30 seconds with a celebrity doing something. Like, it's
But
just,
but I think advertising's here to stay. I remember a few years ago I was teaching a class here at the University of Miami, and I said, listen, I believe soon we're going to see an ad-supported tier on Netflix. And they all laughed at me, like the students, like were smiling and laughing. That's not going to happen. That's not their business model. And sure enough, here it is. Why? Because the cost of creating this content is exorbitant, right? To create good entertainment, it's not cheap. And somebody's got to pay for that. And like I said earlier, I think the implicit bargain between consumers is I will accept advertising if it subsidizes what I want to see. And I think that is still a viable implicit bargain. And it's up to advertisers to make that as enjoyable as possible for the viewer.
100%. Could not agree more.
well, Tim Nudd, creativity editor at AdAge magazine. It has been a real pleasure to have you on to hear your views. And I think we have a good reason, a more than good reason, to have you back at some point in the future, just to kind of see where we are, to check in.
Sure.
Maybe we'll do a post Super Bowl episode
Yeah.
where we talk about the work.
Or we
Would
could
love
do
to come back. Yeah.
a post Cannes. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that happened at Cannes this year, and I know that you had an article that came out recently about some hidden gems at Cannes. So there's lots of opportunities for us to check in with you to see where you are and your take on the world, because you have a slightly different perspective, and we've really appreciated having you on the Brief Brothers. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, this was really fun chat, guys. Thank you so much.
Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Ibach, and together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time, bye bye.